In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a star actor is found dead in a locked dressing room, a dagger in his chest. Was it the ambitious director, the envious co-star, the vengeful stagehand, or the sharp-tongued critic? Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eyes and knitting needles, unravels a web of jealousy and secrets, where a scent of lavender and a cruel note reveal a killer desperate for the spotlight. In this chilling tale, truth takes center stage. Chapter 1. The Curtain Falls. The village of St. Mary Mead lay nestled in the gentle folds of the English countryside, its thatched cottages and winding lanes bathed in the soft glow of an autumn evening. To the casual observer, it was a place of tranquil routine, where the rhythm of life seldom faltered. Yet on this particular evening, the air thrummed with an unusual excitement. For the saint. Mary Mead Playhouse was alight with anticipation. The annual amateur production, The Crimson Veil, was to be performed, and the village had turned out in force for the final dress rehearsal. At the heart of the spectacle was Victor Langston, the lead actor, whose magnetic presence and resonant voice had made him the darling of the local stage. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her modest cottage by a crackling fire, was not among the bustling crowd at the playhouse. Her frail frame, wrapped in a shawl of soft wool, rested comfortably in her favorite armchair, her knitting needles clicking with a steady, almost meditative rhythm. The faint scent of lavender from her garden drifted through the open window, mingling with the warmth of the room. She had declined an invitation to the rehearsal, citing a touch of rheumatism, but her mind was far from idle. The playhouse, she knew, was more than a stage for drama. It was a mirror to human nature, where passions and rivalries played out as vividly as any script. The evening's peace was shattered when Dr. Haydock, the village physician, arrived at her door, his face flushed from a brisk walk. His overcoat was dusted with the first leaves of autumn, and his usually jovial demeanor was shadowed with unease. "Jane," he said, settling into the chair opposite her. "There's been a dreadful business at the playhouse. Victor Langston is dead. Murdered, they say, right in his dressing room during intermission." Miss Marple's needles paused, her pale blue eyes lifting to meet his. "Murdered," she repeated softly, her voice carrying a quiet curiosity that belied the sharpness of her mind. "Dear me, how very shocking. Tell me everything, Doctor." Dr. Haydock leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "It's the strangest thing. Victor was found slumped over his dressing table, a dagger in his chest, one of those ornate props from the play. The room was locked from the inside, Jane, and no one saw a soul go in or out. The whole place is in an uproar. Inspector Craddock's there now, questioning everyone, but it's a puzzle, no mistake." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her mind already turning over the details like a seamstress examining a pattern. "A locked room," she murmured, her needles resuming their gentle rhythm. "How very like a play itself. And who was there, Doctor? Who might have had cause to wish poor Mr. Langston harm?" Haydock sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Half the village was in the audience, but the key players, pardon the phrase, are the ones closest to the production. There's Roland Finch, the director, a man with a temper and dreams bigger than this village can hold. Then there's Clara Vane, Victor's co-star, a young woman with a spark of ambition in her eyes. Tom Breyer, the stagehand, was backstage all evening, handling the props, including that dagger. And Evelyn Hurst, that critic from London, was there too. Her reviews have been sharp enough to cut glass, especially where Victor was concerned. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her thoughts racing. She knew the playhouse well, not from attending its performances, but from the gossip that flowed through St. Mary Mead like a river. Victor Langston had been a man of charm, but charm, she knew, often masked flaws. His flair for the dramatic had won hearts, but it had also stirred envy and resentment. A dagger, she said thoughtfully. Such a theatrical choice. And the room locked from the inside, you say? Yes, Haydock replied. The key was in Victor's pocket, and the door's lock is one of those old sturdy ones. No sign of tampering. The cast and crew are beside themselves, and the village is already whispering about feuds and jealousies. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her hands folding neatly in her lap. People do talk, don't they? She said, a faint smile touching her lips. But talk is like a stage direction, useful only if you know what lies behind it. I think, Doctor, I shall take a walk to the playhouse tomorrow. A little fresh air might do me good, and one never knows what one might observe. Haydock chuckled, though his eyes remained troubled. You're up to something, Jane. I've seen that look before. You'll have Craddock tearing his hair out. Nonsense, she replied, her tone mild but her gaze keen. I'm only an old woman with a fondness for puzzles, but murder, Doctor, is never as simple as it seems. It's like a badly knitted scarf. One wrong stitch, and the whole thing unravels. As Haydock took his leave, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the fire casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the village settled into the quiet of night, but her mind was already at the playhouse, picturing the locked dressing room, the gleaming dagger, and the players who moved around it. A stage, she thought, is a dangerous place when the drama leaves the script. And with that, she tied off a stitch, her thoughts as precise and unyielding as the pattern in her hands. Chapter 2. The Players Assemble. The morning after Victor Langston's untimely demise, St. Mary Mead awoke under a sky heavy with clouds, as though the heavens themselves mourned the tragedy at the playhouse. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the damp chill, wrapped herself in a sensible tweed coat, tucked her knitting bag under her arm, and set off down the lane toward the village center. Her step was brisk for a woman of her years, though her keen eyes missed nothing: the flutter of curtains in Mrs. Price's window, the hurried whisper of two maids outside the grocer's, the way the milkman lingered to gossip with the postmistress. Murder, Miss Marple knew, stirred a village like a stone cast into a still pond, sending ripples through every conversation. The playhouse, a quaint stone building with ivy creeping up its walls, stood at the edge of the village green. Its arched windows and weathered sign, proclaiming St. Mary Mead Amateur Dramatic Society, gave it an air of faded grandeur, like an aging actress still clinging to her youth. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old velvet curtains and polished wood, tinged with the faint metallic tang of stage paint. The auditorium was dim, its rows of seats empty save for a cluster of figures near the stage, where Inspector Craddock, a sturdy man with a no-nonsense air, was conducting his inquiries. His notebook lay open on a prop table, and his pencil moved steadily as he questioned the assembled suspects. Miss Marple slipped quietly into a seat at the back, her presence unnoticed amid the tension. She adjusted her spectacles and drew out her knitting, the soft click of her needles blending with the murmurs of the group. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster, perhaps a curious villager come to pay her respects. But her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, took in every detail: the stiff posture of Roland Finch, the director; the calculated poise of Clara Vane, the co-star; the restless fidgeting of Tom Breyer, the stagehand; and the cool detachment of Evelyn Hurst, the critic. Each, she thought, was playing a role, and not one of them was entirely convincing. Inspector Craddock, his voice carrying the clipped authority of a man accustomed to order, was addressing Roland Finch. "Mr. Finch, you say you were in the lighting booth during the intermission, adjusting the spots for the second act. Can anyone confirm this?" Roland, a lean man in his 40s with a mane of dark hair and a penchant for dramatic gestures, spread his hands in exasperation. "Confirm it? My dear Inspector, the booth is a solitary place, my sanctuary, if you will. I was ensuring the lighting would do justice to Victor's performance. A director's work is never done, you know." His voice, rich with theatrical flourish, faltered slightly under Craddock's steady gaze. Miss Marple's needles paused. Roland's words were polished, but there was a tremor in his hands, a flicker of unease that suggested more than artistic devotion. She recalled Mrs. Bantry's gossip over tea the previous week. Roland had been furious with Victor for altering lines without consultation, claiming it undermined his vision. "He's a tyrant on that stage," Mrs. Bantry had said, her eyes wide. "I heard him tell Victor he'd ruin him if he didn't follow orders." Miss Marple tucked the thought away, her needles resuming their rhythm. Craddock turned to Clara Vane, who stood with her arms crossed, her auburn hair catching the dim light like a halo. She was young, perhaps 25, with the kind of beauty that demanded attention. A perfect fit for the stage, yet always a step behind Victor's brilliance. "Miss Vane," Craddock said, "you claim you were in the rehearsal room, practicing your lines alone. No one saw you there?" Clara's lips curved into a smile, practiced and disarming. "Inspector, I'm an actress. I need solitude to perfect my craft. The rehearsal room was quiet, and I was deep in my lines. Surely you don't think I'd have any reason to harm Victor? He was my mentor, my inspiration." Her voice was smooth, but her eyes darted briefly toward the stage, where the prop table stood, its array of objects now cordoned off by police tape. Miss Marple's gaze followed Clara's, noting the prop table's proximity to the dressing room corridor. Clara's alibi was convenient, too convenient, perhaps. The village dressmaker, Miss Hartnell, had mentioned Clara's frustration at being perpetually cast as the second lead. "She's got talent," Miss Hartnell had said, threading a needle with precision. "But Victor hogged the spotlight. Clara told me she'd give anything to play the lead just once." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Ambition, she knew, could curdle into something darker. Next was Tom Breyer, the stagehand, a burly man with weathered hands and a permanent scowl. His overalls were stained with paint, and his boots left faint smudges on the polished floor. "I was backstage, moving scenery," he grunted, his voice low and grudging. "Heavy flats for the second act. Didn't see nothing, didn't hear nothing. That's all I got to say." Craddock's pencil tapped his notebook. "The dagger came from your prop table, Mr. Breyer. You're responsible for those items, are you not?" Tom's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Aye, I am. But anyone could have grabbed it. Table's right there, plain as day. I don't keep a ledger of who touches what." His eyes flicked to the floor, avoiding Craddock's scrutiny. Miss Marple studied Tom's rough hands, calloused from years of labor. The village pub, where Tom was a regular, had yielded whispers of his past. Once an aspiring actor, he'd auditioned for a lead role years ago, only to be mocked by Victor for his lack of polish. Humiliated him, Victor did, the barman had told her, polishing a glass. Tom's never been the same since. A man with a grudge, Miss Marple thought, might bide his time, and a prop table offered easy access to a weapon. Finally, Craddock turned to Evelyn Hurst, the critic, a woman in her 50s with a severe bob and a pen perpetually tucked behind her ear. Her tailored suit and sharp features gave her an air of authority, and her voice carried the crisp precision of a schoolmistress. "I was in the foyer, Inspector, writing notes for my review. The usher, young Tommy Hill, saw me there. I had no reason to go backstage, and certainly no desire to tangle with Victor's ego." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "Your last review called Mr. Langston a relic of better days. He wasn't pleased, I hear. Threatened legal action, didn't he?" Evelyn's lips thinned. "He made a fuss, yes, but that's hardly motive for murder. I write what I see, Inspector. Victor's performance was tired, and I said so. If he couldn't handle criticism, that's his failing, not mine." Miss Marple's needles moved steadily, but her mind lingered on Evelyn. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, had mentioned a heated exchange between Victor and Evelyn at a recent village fete. "He called her a vulture," Mrs. Clement had whispered, pouring tea. "Said she'd regret crossing him." Evelyn's alibi seemed solid, but Miss Marple noted the fountain pen behind her ear, its silver tip glinting. A critic's words could wound, but a pen, she mused, might leave other marks. As Craddock continued his questions, Miss Marple rose quietly, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. She moved toward the stage, her steps deliberate but unhurried, as though merely stretching her legs. The prop table drew her attention, its surface cluttered with goblets, candlesticks, and a space where the dagger had lain. She noted its position, steps from the dressing-room corridor, easily accessible to anyone backstage. A folded program lay nearby, its edge torn, and she bent to examine it, her fingers brushing the paper. "Careless," she murmured, though whether she meant the tear or something else was unclear. She drifted toward the corridor, where a constable stood guard outside Victor's dressing room. The door was ajar, revealing a small space cluttered with costumes and a mirror framed with light bulbs. The dressing table bore a faint stain. Spilled water, perhaps, or something more telling. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on a small vent above the door, barely wide enough for a hand. "Curious," she said softly, committing the detail to memory. Returning to the auditorium, she caught a snippet of Clara's conversation with Roland, their voices low but tense. "You should have backed me," Clara hissed, her eyes flashing. Roland's reply was sharp but inaudible as they noticed Miss Marple's approach and fell silent. She smiled benignly, settling back into her seat, but her mind was a whirl of observations. Clara's quick temper, Roland's defensiveness, Tom's sullen reserve, Evelyn's icy calm. Each was a thread in a tapestry yet to be woven. Inspector Craddock concluded his interviews, snapping his notebook shut. "We'll need statements from everyone in the building that night," he announced. "No one leaves St. Mary Mead until I say so." The suspects dispersed, their faces a mix of indignation and unease. Miss Marple remained, her knitting a steady rhythm in the quiet. Craddock approached, his expression a blend of respect and exasperation. "Miss Marple, I might have known you'd be here. Care to share any thoughts?" She looked up, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "Oh, Inspector, I'm just an old woman who enjoys the theater. But I will say, people are rarely where they claim to be, especially when there's a stage involved. It's all about timing, isn't it? And motive." She paused, her needles still. "I wonder, did anyone check the lighting booth ladder? Dust can tell such stories." Craddock's brow furrowed, but he nodded. "I'll have it looked at. You're a sharp one, Miss Marple." He tipped his hat and strode off, leaving her to her knitting. As the playhouse emptied, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze sweeping the stage. The heavy curtains, the scuffed boards, the props waiting for their next act. It was a world of illusion, where truth hid behind grease paint and bravado. She thought of Victor, his charisma now silenced, and of the four who stood to gain from his absence. "A play within a play," she murmured, tucking her knitting away. "And someone has written a very dark scene indeed." She stepped into the cool air of the village green, the clouds parting to reveal a sliver of sun. St. Mary Mead would talk of nothing but the murder for weeks, but Miss Marple knew talk was only the surface. Beneath it lay secrets, and she intended to unravel them, stitch by careful stitch. Chapter 3. The Director's Ambition. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of St. Mary Mead as Miss Jane Marple made her way along the high street, her umbrella tucked under one arm and her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. The village was awake, its pulse quickened by the tragedy at the playhouse, and every shop window seemed to hum with whispered theories about Victor Langston's murder. Miss Marple, however, was not one for idle speculation. Her mind, as sharp as the needles in her bag, was already piecing together the fragments of the previous day's observations. And today, her focus turned to Roland Finch, the director whose grand gestures masked a restlessness she found intriguing. She paused at the village tea shop, a cozy establishment run by Miss Weatherby, whose knack for gossip rivaled her skill with scones. Over a pot of Earl Grey, Miss Marple listened as Miss Weatherby recounted a recent altercation at the playhouse. "Roland was in a right state," she said, her eyes gleaming as she leaned across the counter. Shouting at Victor something fierce about changing, the blocking for the final scene. Said it ruined his vision. I heard it from Mrs. Bantry, who was there delivering flowers for the stage. Roland told Victor he'd pay for his arrogance, his very words. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression one of polite interest, though her mind filed away the phrase. "Arrogance?" she murmured. "How very telling. And did Mr. Finch seem himself afterward?" Miss Weatherby shook her head, her curls bouncing. "Not a bit. He was all nerves at the rehearsal dinner, snapping at poor Clara Vane when she missed a cue. He's got his heart set on bigger things. That one. London, perhaps, or even Broadway. Victor was his ticket, but only if he played by Roland's rules." Thanking Miss Weatherby, Miss Marple continued to the playhouse, where the doors stood open to air out the musty interior. The auditorium was quiet, save for the creak of floorboards as a constable patrolled the aisles. Inspector Craddock had mentioned that Roland would be there, organizing props for the police's inventory, and Miss Marple found him on the stage, his sleeves rolled up, sorting through a pile of costumes with an air of distracted intensity. "Good morning, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice soft but clear as she approached. "Such a sad business, all this. I do hope you're managing." Roland started, his dark eyes flicking to her before softening into a practiced smile. "Miss Marple, isn't it? Kind of you to come by. Yes, it's a dreadful shock. Victor was the soul of our production. His hands moved restlessly, folding a velvet cloak with unnecessary care. Miss Marple settled onto a nearby chair, her knitting emerging from her bag like a conjurer's trick. He was quite the talent, I hear. It must have been a challenge, directing such a strong personality. Roland's smile tightened. Victor had his ways, but genius always does. We had our differences, creative ones, you understand, but I respected him. He gestured toward the lighting booth, a narrow platform, high above the stage, accessible by a steep ladder. I was up there during intermission, adjusting the spots. Couldn't have been near his dressing room when it happened. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her eyes drifting to the ladder. The lighting booth must offer such a view, she said. All the comings and goings below, like a stage manager's dream. Did you see anything unusual that night? Roland hesitated, his fingers pausing on a prop sword. It was intermission. Everyone was milling about. I was focused on the lights. The second act needed precision, you see. His voice carried a note of defensiveness, and Miss Marple noted the faint flush creeping up his neck. With a nod, she rose and approached the ladder, her movements slow but deliberate. "May I?" she asked, though she was already testing the first rung with her foot. Roland hurried to her side, protesting, but she waved him off with a smile. "Oh, I'm quite spry, Mr. Finch. Just a quick look." The ladder was sturdy, its rungs worn smooth by years of use, but as she climbed, carefully, for her rheumatism was not entirely a fiction, she noted a curious detail. The upper rungs were coated in a fine layer of dust, undisturbed save for a single smudge, as though someone had gripped it briefly and then thought better of climbing further. At the booth itself, a cramped space filled with levers and switches, she found the floor equally dusty, with no footprints to suggest recent use. "How curious," she murmured, descending with care. One would think a director's perch would be well trodden. Roland's eyes narrowed, but he shrugged. "I don't linger up there. I was in and out, checking the angles. The dust proves nothing." His tone was sharp, and Miss Marple's smile remained serene. "Of course," she said, returning to her chair. "But a director's eye misses little, I imagine. You must know your cast so well, their habits, their tensions." Roland relaxed slightly, as though relieved to steer the conversation elsewhere. "They're a talented lot, but theater breeds egos. Victor was demanding. Clara wanted more lines, Tom grumbled about the props, and that critic, Evelyn Hurst, was always poking her nose in, scribbling her poison. Miss Marple's needles paused. "Miss Hurst does have a way with words. I understand she and Victor had a falling out." Roland snorted. "A falling out? Victor threatened to have her barred from the playhouse after her last review, called her a vulture in tweed. Not that I blame him, her pen's sharper than that dagger." He caught himself, his face paling. "Not that I mean, well, you know." "Quite," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but her eyes keen. "Words can wound as deeply as actions, can't they? And ambition, such a driving force. I recall a young man in my village, years ago, who dreamed of fame beyond our little stage. He pushed too hard, and it ended in tears. Ambition can be a dangerous thing, Mr. Finch." Roland's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, turning back to his costumes with a mutter about deadlines. Miss Marple tucked her knitting away and took her leave, pausing at the playhouse door to glance back at the stage. The lighting booth loomed above, its shadows deep and unyielding. She thought of Roland's flushed cheeks, his quick deflection, and the undisturbed dust. A man with dreams, she mused, stepping into the damp air. But dreams can turn to desperation so easily. As she walked home, she passed the village hall, where a group of women were arranging flowers for Victor's memorial. Mrs. Bantry, her friend, and a stalwart of the Dramatic Society, waved her over. "Jane, you've been to the playhouse, haven't you?" she said, her voice low. "What do you make of Roland? He's been odd since the murder, burning papers in his garden. Last night, my maid said. Looked like old scripts, but who burns scripts?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "How very curious," she said. "Perhaps he's tidying up, or perhaps he's hiding something. People do strange things when they're afraid, don't they?" Mrs. Bantry nodded, her expression grave. "And Roland's afraid, Jane. I saw him this morning, pacing outside the playhouse like a caged animal. He's got his sights set on bigger stages, but Victor was his star. Without him, the play's in trouble, unless Roland sees this as his chance to shine." Miss Marple thanked her and continued on, her mind turning over the new information. Roland's ambition was no secret, but ambition paired with fear could be a volatile mix. She recalled a nephew of hers, Raymond, who once spoke of a director he'd met in London, a man so consumed by his vision that he'd sabotaged a rival to secure a production. "Theater folk," Raymond had said, laughing, "are as ruthless as any politician." Miss Marple had smiled then, but now the memory took on a darker hue. At her cottage, she settled by the fire, her knitting resumed. The dust on the ladder nagged at her. A small detail, but details, she knew, were the threads of truth. Roland's alibi rested on his presence in the booth, yet the dust suggested otherwise. Had he lied? And if so, where had he been during those crucial minutes of intermission? The burned scripts, too, were a puzzle. Scripts were precious to a director, each page a piece of their legacy. To destroy them spoke of panic or calculation. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the other suspects. Clara's ambition, Tom's grudge, Evelyn's venom, all were threads in the same tapestry, but Roland's role was becoming clearer. "A director controls the stage," she murmured, her needles clicking. "But a murderer controls the shadows." She would need to watch Roland Finch closely, for ambition, she knew, could twist a heart as surely as a rope. Chapter 4. The Co-Star's Envy. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across St. Mary Mead, gilding the village green with a deceptive warmth that did little to dispel the chill of recent events. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag slung over her arm, walked with purpose toward the playhouse, her thoughts fixed on Clara Vane, the young actress whose beauty and ambition had not gone unnoticed. The village was abuzz with talk of Victor Langston's murder, and Clara's name surfaced often in the whispers. Her charm, her rivalry with the late star, her hunger for the spotlight. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the undercurrents of human nature, sensed that Clara's poised exterior concealed a storm of emotion, and she intended to probe its depths. As she passed the village shop, Miss Marple paused to exchange pleasantries with Miss Hartnell, the dressmaker, whose nimble fingers and sharp tongue made her a font of local knowledge. "Clara Vane came by yesterday," Miss Hartnell said, her eyes narrowing as she pinned a hem. "Wanted a new gown for the play, now that she's likely to take Victor's role. Bold as brass, that one, talking of stardom while the poor man's barely cold. She told me Victor promised her the lead next season, then went back on his word. Said it broke her heart. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her mind filing away the detail. "How distressing for her," she said, her voice mild. "Ambition can be such a heavy burden, can't it? Especially when it's thwarted." Miss Hartnell nodded, her needle flashing. "She's got talent, mind you, but Victor outshone her like the sun does a candle. I saw her at rehearsals, watching him with a look that could curdle milk. Envy's a wicked thing, Miss Marple." With a thoughtful nod, Miss Marple continued to the playhouse, where the doors stood ajar, admitting a draught that stirred the heavy stage curtains. Inside, the auditorium was quiet, the police having concluded their morning's work. Clara Vane was on the stage, rehearsing lines with a forced intensity, her voice ringing out in the empty space. She wore a simple dress, but her auburn hair was swept up in a style that suggested she was already preparing for a starring role. Miss Marple slipped into a seat near the back, her knitting emerging as if by habit, the soft click of her needles a counterpoint to Clara's recitation. Clara paused midline, catching sight of the elderly woman. "Miss Marple," she called, her smile bright but brittle. "Come to see the show go on, have you? We're soldiering through, despite everything." Her voice faltered on the last word, and she turned away, adjusting a prop chair with unnecessary care. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her gaze was keen. "Such resilience," she said, her tone warm. "It must be difficult, stepping into such a tragedy. You and Mr. Langston were close, I understand." Clara's hands stilled, and she faced Miss Marple, her expression a careful blend of grief and professionalism. "Victor was a mentor," she said. "He taught me so much about the craft. Of course, we had our differences, every actor does, but I admired him." Her fingers brushed a locket at her throat, a nervous gesture that did not escape Miss Marple's notice. "Admiration is a fine thing," Miss Marple said, her needles moving steadily. "But the stage can be a trying place, can it not? All those dreams, vying for the same light. I remember a young girl in my village, years ago, who longed to be a star. She worked so hard, but when another took her place, it changed her. Envy, you see, can make one do such unexpected things." Clara's smile tightened, and she stepped down from the stage, her movements graceful but deliberate. "I'm not sure what you mean, Miss Marple. I was content with my role. Victor was the lead, and I respected that." She paused, then added, "I was in the rehearsal room during intermission, going over my lines, alone. I had no reason to be anywhere else." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the corridor that led to the dressing rooms. "Of course," she said, "solitude is so important for an actress, though I imagine you must have passed by Mr. Langston's dressing room now and then. Such a small theater, and those corridors so narrow." Clara's eyes flickered, but she held Miss Marple's gaze. "I suppose I might have, earlier in the evening. We all move about backstage, but I wasn't there when it happened." Her voice was steady, but her hand strayed to the locket again, twisting it between her fingers. Miss Marple's needles paused as she rose, her movements slow but purposeful. "Might I see the dressing room?" she asked, her tone one of innocent curiosity. "I've always been fascinated by the behind-the-scenes of a play." Clara hesitated, then nodded, leading the way down the corridor. The dressing room was as Miss Marple had seen it briefly before, a cramped space with a mirror framed by light bulbs, a cluttered table, and a single chair still toppled from the night of the murder. The air held a faint scent, not of grease paint or dust, but something sweeter, floral. Miss Marple's nose twitched. "Lavender," she said softly, almost to herself. "How pleasant." Clara's expression remained neutral, but her shoulders stiffened. "Victor liked to keep things fresh," she said quickly. "He used scented oils sometimes for nerves." Miss Marple bent to examine the dressing table, noting a small glass, its contents long since spilled and dried on the wood. The stain was faint, but the scent of lavender lingered, stronger here than in the air. She straightened, her eyes catching a detail she had missed before, a single auburn hair caught in the hinge of the mirror. It matched Clara's perfectly, though she made no comment. "Such a tragedy," she said instead. "And in a locked room, no less. It's like something from a play, isn't it?" Clara's laugh was sharp, almost brittle. "A play with a terrible ending. I still can't believe it." She turned away, adjusting a costume hanging on the wall, her movements quick and restless. Miss Marple lingered, her gaze sweeping the room. The vent above the door, narrow and high, caught her eye again. It was too small for entry, but she wondered if it might have served another purpose. "Did you ever notice," she said almost absently, "how sounds carry in a place like this? Voices, footsteps, even a scent. They drift where you least expect." Clara's eyes narrowed, but she nodded. "Theater's full of echoes," she said. "But I was in the rehearsal room, as I said. I didn't hear anything unusual." Miss Marple smiled, tucking her knitting away. "Of course, my dear. I'm sure you were quite absorbed in your lines." She thanked Clara and made her way back to the auditorium, her mind turning over the encounter. The lavender scent, the auburn hair, the nervous gesture with the locket. These were small threads, but Miss Marple knew that even the smallest thread could unravel a lie. Outside, she met Inspector Craddock, who was conferring with a constable near the prop table. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone a mix of amusement and respect. "Poking about again, are you? Find anything interesting?" She tilted her head, her expression guileless. "Only the usual clutter of a theater, Inspector, though I did notice a rather strong scent of lavender in Mr. Langston's dressing room. Curious, don't you think, for a man's space?" Craddock's brow furrowed. "Lavender? I'll have it checked. You've got a nose for these things, haven't you?" He jotted a note, then added, "Clara Vane's alibi is thin. No one saw her in that rehearsal room, but we've no proof she was anywhere else." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes twinkling. "Proof is such a stubborn thing, Inspector. It hides in the smallest places, like a dropped stitch. I wonder, have you looked at Miss Vane's belongings? An actress might carry all sorts of things. Oils, perhaps, for calming nerves." Craddock's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. "I'll see to it. You're a marvel, Miss Marple." He turned back to his constable, and Miss Marple made her way home, the village green now bathed in the soft glow of twilight. As she settled by her fire, her knitting resumed. She thought of Clara Vane, her beauty, her ambition, the faint tremor in her voice. Envy, Miss Marple knew, was a motive as old as Cain, and Clara's desire for the lead role was no secret. The lavender scent, the auburn hair, these were clues, but not yet proof. She recalled a young woman in her village, long ago, who had sabotaged a rival's costume to secure a part. It wasn't hatred, the woman had confessed years later. It was wanting what she had. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. Clara Vane wanted what Victor had, and that want, she suspected, had led to a fatal act. Chapter 5. The Stagehand's Grudge. The drizzle that had threatened St. Mary Mead all morning finally descended as Miss Jane Marple stepped out of her cottage, her umbrella raised against the fine mist. The village, usually so vibrant with chatter, seemed subdued, as though the weight of Victor Langston's murder had settled into its very stones. Miss Marple's destination was the Blue Boar, the local pub where Tom Breyer, the Playhouse stagehand, was known to spend his evenings. Her interest in Tom had been piqued by whispers of his past, and she intended to learn more about the man whose rough hands had handled the fatal dagger. The Blue Boar was a low-beamed establishment, its walls darkened by years of smoke and laughter. As Miss Marple entered, shaking the rain from her umbrella, the barman, Mr. Polk, looked up with a nod. "Miss Marple," he said, polishing a glass with a practiced hand. "Not your usual haunt, is it? Come about poor Victor, I wager." Miss Marple smiled, settling onto a stool at the counter. "You know me too well, Mr. Polk. I was hoping you might share a word or two about Tom Breyer. He's been much on my mind, with all this trouble at the Playhouse." Mr. Polk's eyes gleamed with the delight of a man who loved a tale. "Tom's a regular here, right enough. Keeps to himself, mostly, but he's got a temper when roused. Years back, he fancied himself an actor, auditioned for a big role at the Playhouse. Victor was on the panel, and word is he tore into Tom something fierce, laughed him off the stage, said he'd no more talent than a cart horse. Tom's never set foot on a stage since, just hauls scenery and fixes props." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "He's been sour about Victor ever since. Last week I heard him muttering about settling scores." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind catalogued the detail. "How very unfortunate," she said. "A wound like that festers, doesn't it? Was Tom here the night of the murder?" Mr. Polk shook his head. "Not after the rehearsal started. He was at the Playhouse, working the stage. Said he was moving flats during intermission, but I don't know who'd vouch for him. Tom's not one for company." Thanking him, Miss Marple made her way to the Playhouse, where the air was thick with the scent of sawdust and paint. The stage was quiet, the police having finished their latest sweep, but Tom Breyer was there, hunched over a workbench backstage, his tools spread out like a surgeon's instruments. His broad shoulders and weathered face gave him the look of a man more suited to labor than the delicate art of theater. Yet his hands moved with surprising precision, repairing a broken prop chair. "Good afternoon, Mr. Breyer," Miss Marple said, her voice carrying a gentle warmth. "You're hard at work, I see. Such a pity about Mr. Langston. It must be difficult carrying on." Tom glanced up, his eyes narrowing, but he grunted in acknowledgement. "Work's work, miss. Someone's got to keep this place running." He returned to his task, his hammer tapping rhythmically. Miss Marple settled onto a nearby crate, her knitting emerging from her bag. "You must know every corner of this theater," she said. "All those props, so carefully managed. That dagger, for instance. It came from your table, didn't it?" Tom's hammer paused, and he fixed her with a wary look. "Aye, it did, but anyone could have taken it. I don't lock the table. Never needed to. I was moving scenery during intermission like I told the inspector. Didn't see nothing, didn't hear nothing." His voice was gruff, but there was a tightness to it, as though the words were rehearsed. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Of course," she said. "It's such a busy time. Intermission. Everyone rushing about. I imagine you'd notice if something was amiss, though. You've such a keen eye for detail." She gestured to his workbench, where every tool was aligned with meticulous care. "Your toolbox is so orderly. It reminds me of my nephew's desk, all his pens in a row. A man who values order notices things." Tom's jaw tightened, but he shrugged. "I keep things tidy. Doesn't mean I saw who took the dagger. Could have been anyone. Cast, crew, even that critic woman poking about." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the prop table a few steps away. It was a jumble of objects, goblets, books, a candelabra, but the space where the dagger had rested was marked by a faint outline in the dust. She rose, her movements slow, and approached the table, her fingers brushing the edge. "Such a striking prop," she said. "Heavy, I suppose, not something one picks up by chance." Tom followed her gaze, his hands stilling. "Heavy enough," he said. "Bronze, not steel, but it'd do damage. Whoever took it knew what they were about." His tone was flat, but his eyes flicked to the corridor leading to the dressing rooms, a fleeting glance that Miss Marple noted. She wandered toward the corridor, pausing at the entrance. "This leads to Mr. Langston's dressing room, doesn't it?" she asked, her tone one of innocent curiosity. "You must pass by often, checking props and such." Tom's face darkened. "I stick to my work, miss. Don't go snooping in dressing rooms." He turned back to his chair, his movements brusque, as though eager to end the conversation. Miss Marple lingered, her eyes scanning the backstage area. The scenery flats Tom claimed to have moved were stacked against a wall, their surfaces scuffed but orderly. She noted a faint mark on the floor, a scrape that suggested something heavy had been shifted recently. But not, she thought, during the chaos of intermission. The mark was too precise, too deliberate. "Curious," she murmured, filing the observation away. Returning to Tom, she smiled. "You remind me of a gardener I once knew," she said. "He took such pride in his tools, but he held a grudge against a neighbor who'd mocked his roses. Years later, that grudge came out in the most unexpected way. A small thing, a slight, can linger, can't it?" Tom's hands froze, and he looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I don't hold grudges," he said, but his voice was low, almost a growl. "Victor was a fool, but I did my job. That's all there is to it." Miss Marple nodded, tucking her knitting away. "Of course, Mr. Briar. Duty is a fine thing." She thanked him and stepped into the damp air outside, where the drizzle had softened to a mist. As she walked home, she passed the village green, where a group of children played, their laughter a stark contrast to the grim puzzle occupying her mind. At her cottage, she met Inspector Craddock, who was waiting by her gate, his hat damp from the rain. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat. "I've just come from the playhouse. Tom Briar's story holds, but it's flimsy. No one can confirm he was moving those flats, and that prop table's a mess. Anyone could have grabbed the dagger." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Indeed, Inspector, but a man like Mr. Briar, so careful with his tools, might notice more than he says. I wonder, have you checked the scenery flats? A mark on the floor caught my eye. Fresh, but not quite fresh enough for intermission." Craddock's eyebrows rose. "You don't miss much, do you? I'll have the lads look at it. Anything else?" She tilted her head, her expression guileless. "Only a thought, Inspector. A man who's been mocked might wait years for his moment, and a stagehand knows every shadow in a theater." She paused, then added, "Have you spoken to the usher, Tommy Hill? He's a sharp lad, might have seen Mr. Briar backstage." Craddock jotted a note, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "You're a step ahead, as usual. I'll check with the boy. Keep this up, and I'll be out of a job." Miss Marple chuckled, but as she entered her cottage and settled by the fire, her knitting resumed with a steady rhythm. Tom Brier's grudge was a thread in the tapestry, as tangible as Clara's envy or Roland's ambition. The scrape on the floor, the orderly toolbox, the fleeting glance toward the corridor, these were clues, small but telling. She thought of a neighbor from her youth, a quiet man who'd nursed a slight until it erupted in a petty act of vengeance. "A wound to pride," she murmured, "can fester longer than any wound to the body." Tom Brier, she suspected, had carried such a wound, and she would watch him closely to see where it led. Chapter 6. The Critic's Venom. The late afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns across her sitting room as she prepared for an evening visit to the vicarage. The village of St. Mary Mead, though still abuzz with talk of Victor Langston's murder, had settled into an uneasy rhythm, with the playhouse at its heart like a wound that refused to heal. Miss Marple's thoughts, however, were fixed on Evelyn Hurst, the critic whose sharp pen had drawn blood long before the dagger struck. Her reviews, laced with a wit that bordered on cruelty, had made her a figure of both fear and fascination, and Miss Marple suspected that her role in the drama was far from incidental. She arrived at the vicarage just as the clock struck 6, her knitting bag tucked under her arm and her sensible hat firmly in place. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, welcomed her with a warm smile and a steaming pot of tea. The vicarage parlor, with its chintz armchairs and faded rugs, was a haven of comfort, but Mrs. Clement's eyes held a spark of curiosity. "Jane," she said, pouring tea, "you've been poking about the playhouse, haven't you? Everyone's talking about Evelyn Hurst. Did you know she and Victor had a dreadful row at the fete last month? He called her a vulture in tweed and said she'd regret her last review. I heard it from Mrs. Price, who was serving lemonade nearby." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile as she accepted a cup. "How very colorful," she said. "Miss Hurst does have a reputation for her words, doesn't she? I suppose a critic's pen can stir as much trouble as a director's temper." Mrs. Clement nodded, her hands busy with a plate of biscuits. "Oh, she's a terror. Her review of The Crimson Veil called Victor a fading star, propped up by nostalgia. He was livid, threatened to sue her for libel, though I doubt he meant it. Still, Evelyn didn't bat an eye. She's staying at the Bell Inn, you know, working on her next column. I saw her there yesterday, scribbling away with that fancy fountain pen of hers." Miss Marple's needles emerged from her bag, their soft click a familiar counterpoint to her thoughts. "A fountain pen," she murmured. "How distinctive. And such a public quarrel with Mr. Langston. Most unwise in a village like ours." She sipped her tea, her mind turning over the detail of the pen. She had noticed a smudge of ink on Victor's dressing room door, a deep blue that stood out against the faded paint. Could it be a coincidence, or was it a thread worth pulling? Bidding Mrs. Clement farewell, Miss Marple made her way to the Bell Inn, a charming establishment with ivy-clad walls and a reputation for discretion. Evelyn Hurst was in the lounge, seated at a corner table, her severe bob framing a face that was all angles and intensity. Her fountain pen, silver-tipped and gleaming, danced across a notebook, its ink a rich indigo. She looked up as Miss Marple approached, her expression one of polite irritation. "Miss Marple, I presume?" she said, her voice crisp. "I've heard you're something of a village sleuth. Come to interrogate me?" Miss Marple's smile was disarming. "Oh, nothing so dramatic, Miss Hurst. I'm merely an old woman with a fondness for conversation. May I join you? I've always been curious about the life of a critic." Evelyn's lips twitched, as though unsure whether to be amused or wary, but she gestured to a chair. "By all means, though I warn you, I'm not one for small talk." She set her pen down, its tip leaving a faint smudge on the tablecloth. Miss Marple settled in, her knitting bag at her side. "Your work must be fascinating," she said. "To see so many performances, to shape opinions with a few well-chosen words. I imagine Mr. Langston appreciated your candor, even if he disagreed." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, but her tone remained cool. "Victor was a performer, not a saint. My reviews reflect what I see. Nothing more. He took it personally, which was his mistake. I was in the foyer during intermission writing notes. The usher, Tommy Hill, saw me there. I had no reason to go backstage, and certainly no interest in Victor's histrionics." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Of course," she said. "The foyer is such a lively place during intermission, isn't it? All those comings and goings. And yet, so easy to slip away unnoticed. I recall a young critic in my nephew's circle, years ago, who wrote a scathing review that cost an actor his role. The actor never forgave her, and when a chance for revenge came, well, it was quite a scandal." Evelyn's hand stilled on her pen, her expression unreadable. "I don't deal in revenge, Miss Marple. My job is to critique, not to settle scores. Victor's threats were empty. He hadn't the nerve for a lawsuit. Besides, I'm a professional. I don't skulk about dressing rooms with daggers." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the pen. "Such a fine instrument," she said, almost absently. "That deep blue ink, quite distinctive. I noticed a similar shade on Mr. Langston's dressing room door. An odd place for ink, don't you think?" Evelyn's composure flickered, but she recovered quickly. "Theater's a messy place," she said. "Ink, paint, grease paint, it's all over. I'm sure it's nothing." She picked up her pen as though to dismiss the topic and resumed writing. Miss Marple rose, her knitting tucked away. "Quite right," she said. "Theater is full of surprises. Thank you for your time. Miss Hurst, I do hope your next review is kinder to our little playhouse." She smiled and left the lounge, her steps slow, but her mind racing. Outside, the drizzle had returned, and Miss Marple raised her umbrella, her thoughts on Evelyn's cool demeanor and the telltale ink. She recalled the smudge on the dressing-room door, a detail Inspector Craddock had overlooked in his initial sweep. It was a small thing, but Miss Marple knew that small things often led to great revelations. She decided to pay a brief visit to the playhouse, where the constable on duty allowed her a moment to examine the door. The smudge was still there, a faint blue streak near the handle, unmistakable in its hue. She made a mental note to mention it to Craddock. As she walked home, she encountered young Tommy Hill, the usher, delivering a parcel to the vicarage. "Tommy," she said, her voice warm, "you were at the playhouse during intermission, weren't you? Did you see Miss Hurst in the foyer the whole time?" Tommy, a lanky lad with a quick smile, nodded. "Mostly, miss. She was there, writing in her notebook, but I was busy with the crowd. Folks wanting programs, asking for seats. She might have stepped away for a minute. I didn't keep an eye on her every second." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind turning over the possibility. Evelyn's alibi was strong, but not airtight. A minute was enough to slip backstage, especially for someone familiar with the playhouse's layout. And the ink, such a specific shade, suggested a connection that could not be ignored. At her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. Inspector Craddock arrived shortly after, his coat damp from the rain. "Miss Marple," he said, shaking his head, "you've got me chasing shadows. I checked the scenery flats as you suggested. There's a scrape, sure enough, but it could be from any time. Tom Breyer's sticking to his story." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes twinkling. "And Miss Hurst? Have you spoken to her about her pen? That blue ink on the dressing-room door is rather striking." Craddock's eyebrows rose. "Ink? I missed that. You're a wonder, Miss Marple. I'll have it tested, see if it matches her pen. Her alibi's solid, but if she was backstage—" He trailed off, jotting a note. Miss Marple smiled. "Words can wound, Inspector, but a pen in the wrong hands might do more. Miss Hurst's reviews cut deep, and Victor's threats were no small thing. A critic's pride is a delicate matter." Craddock chuckled. "You're weaving a net, aren't you? I'll look into it. Anything else?" "Only a thought," she said, her needles clicking. "Check the foyer floor near Miss Hurst's table. A dropped pen leaves marks, and marks tell stories." She paused, her expression guileless. "Like my knitting, Inspector. Every stitch counts." As Craddock left, Miss Marple leaned back, her thoughts on Evelyn Hurst. The critic's venom was clear in her words, but had it spilled over into action? The ink, the fleeting absence from the foyer, the public feud. These were threads in a pattern, and Miss Marple was determined to follow them. She recalled a literary feud in her youth, where a critic's harsh words had led to a broken friendship and a rash act. "Pride," she murmured, "is as dangerous as envy." Evelyn Hurst, she suspected, had more to reveal, and the truth lay in the smallest details. Chapter 7. The Locked Room Puzzle. The morning air in St. Mary Mead carried a crisp edge, as though the village itself were holding its breath after the turmoil of Victor Langston's murder. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a woolen shawl, sat by her cottage window, her knitting needles moving with their usual steady rhythm. Her mind, however, was far from the tranquil pattern in her hands. The locked dressing room where Victor had met his end was a puzzle that nagged at her, its pieces scattered among the suspects' alibis and the playhouse's shadowy corners. Today, she resolved to examine the scene more closely, for she knew that a locked room, like a tangled skein of wool, could be unraveled with patience and a keen eye. She made her way to the playhouse, her steps measured but purposeful, her umbrella serving as both shield against the occasional drizzle and a prop to maintain her air of harmless eccentricity. The village was quieter now, the initial frenzy of gossip giving way to a wary unease, as if the murderer might still lurk among the familiar faces. At the playhouse, a young constable stood guard, his expression brightening at Miss Marple's approach. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his cap. "Inspector Craddock said you might stop by. He's given permission for you to have a look, so long as you don't touch anything." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "How very kind of him," she said. "I assure you, young man, I shall be as unobtrusive as a mouse." She stepped inside, the familiar scent of dust and grease paint enveloping her, and made her way to the corridor leading to Victor's dressing room. The door, now unsealed but still cordoned, stood slightly ajar, and she paused to take in its heavy oak frame and ancient lock, its keyhole gleaming with the patina of years. Inside, the room was much as she had glimpsed before, a cramped space dominated by a dressing table, its mirror framed with bulbs, one of which flickered faintly. The toppled chair lay where it had fallen, a silent witness to the violence that had occurred. The table bore a faint stain, the remnant of spilled water, and the air held a lingering trace of lavender, though fainter now. Miss Marple's gaze settled on the lock, its mechanism old but sturdy, designed to keep the world at bay. She bent closer, her fingers hovering but not touching, noting the absence of scratches or signs of force. "Locked from the inside," she murmured, "with the key in Victor's pocket. How very curious." She straightened, her eyes sweeping the room for clues overlooked in the initial chaos. The small vent above the door caught her attention again, its narrow slats barely wide enough for a breath of air. She stepped onto the toppled chair, steadying herself with a hand on the wall, and peered at the vent. Dust clung to its edges. Undisturbed, but a faint smudge on the surrounding wood suggested something had brushed against it, perhaps a cloth or a sleeve. "Not an entrance," she said softly, "but perhaps a deception." Stepping down, she examined the dressing table, where a few personal items remained. A comb, a script annotated in Victor's bold hand, a half-empty bottle of cologne. The spilled water intrigued her most. The glass, now dry, lay on its side, its contents having left a faint ring on the wood. She crouched, her knees protesting, and noted a tiny fleck of something caught in the grain of the table. A trace of blue, not unlike the ink she had seen on the door. "Ink again," she whispered, her mind flashing to Evelyn Hurst's fountain pen. But the lavender scent, so strongly associated with Clara Vane, tugged at her thoughts as well. Miss Marple moved to the door, testing its weight. It swung heavily, its hinges creaking, and she noted how it sealed tightly against the frame, leaving no gap for prying tools. The key, Inspector Craddock had confirmed, was found in Victor's pocket, its mate kept in the stage manager's office. "He let his killer in," she concluded, her voice barely audible. "Someone he trusted, or at least did not fear." The thought narrowed her focus to the suspects: Roland Finch, Clara Vane, Tom Breyer, Evelyn Hurst, all of whom had reasons to wish Victor harm, yet none with an obvious path into a locked room. She left the dressing room and wandered backstage, where the prop table stood, its contents now catalogued by the police, but still in slight disarray. The space where the dagger had rested was marked by a faint outline, and Miss Marple noted its proximity to the corridor, mere steps from Victor's door. She pictured the bustle of intermission, the cast and crew moving in a choreographed chaos, and considered how easily a hand could have slipped the dagger from its place. Tom Breyer's domain, she thought, but accessible to all. As she pondered, Inspector Craddock appeared, his notebook in hand and a weary expression on his face. "Miss Marple," he said, "I should have known you'd be here, sniffing out clues. Find anything in that room to unravel this mess?" She smiled, her needles emerging from her bag as she settled onto a nearby bench. "Only small things, Inspector. The lock is untouched, the key was in Victor's pocket, and yet the room tells a story. That spilled water, for instance, such an odd detail. And the vent above the door, so narrow yet suggestive." Craddock's brow furrowed. "Suggestive? It's too small for anyone to climb through, and the water, could have been an accident, knocked over in a struggle. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her needles clicking. But accidents in a murder are rarely accidental. I recall a case in my village, years ago, a locked shed, a dead man, and a spilled cup of tea. It turned out the tea was poured deliberately to mask a sound. Small things, Inspector, can hide great intentions. Craddock jotted a note, his expression a mix of skepticism and respect. I'll have the water tested, though I doubt it'll tell us much. We've checked the vent, nothing but dust. The ink smudge you mentioned matches Miss Hurst's pen, by the way, but she swears she never went near the dressing room. Her alibi's still holding, just. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the stage, where the heavy curtains swayed slightly in the draught. Miss Hurst's pen is most interesting, she said. And Miss Vane's lavender scent lingers in that room, doesn't it? I wonder, have you spoken to the cleaning staff? They see so much, yet are so often overlooked. Craddock's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. Good thought. I'll track down the maid who tidied backstage that night. You're a marvel, Miss Marple, always seeing what I miss. She chuckled softly. Nonsense, Inspector. I'm only an old woman who notices patterns. Like my knitting, you see. Each stitch builds on the last, but one wrong move, and the whole thing unravels. She paused, her expression guileless. Have you considered the chair? Toppled, yet not broken. It suggests a moment of surprise, not a struggle. Craddock made another note, shaking his head. You're weaving a net, aren't you? I'll look at the chair again. Anything else? Only a thought, she said, tucking her knitting away. Theater is all about illusion, Inspector. A locked room is the perfect stage for a clever trick. Someone wanted us to believe it was impossible, but impossibility is just a matter of perspective. As Craddock returned to his duties, Miss Marple stepped outside, the drizzle now a fine mist that settled on her shawl. The village green stretched before her, its grass damp and vibrant, and she thought of the locked room, the spilled water, the smudged vent. Each was a thread, and together they formed a pattern she was beginning to discern. She recalled a story her nephew Raymond had told, of a magician who locked himself in a box only to vanish, because the lock, it turned out, was not what it seemed. Illusion, she murmured, is a murderer's best friend. Back at her cottage, she settled by the fire, her knitting resuming its rhythm. The locked room was a challenge, but not an insurmountable one. Victor had let his killer in, she was certain, and the clues, the water, the ink, the lavender, pointed to a careful plan. Roland's ambition, Clara's envy, Tom's grudge, Evelyn's venom, all were motives, but the room itself held the key. A stage, she said softly, where the truth hides behind the curtain. She would return to the playhouse, she decided, and look again, for the smallest detail might yet unlock the mystery. Chapter 8. A Village of Secrets. The morning mist had lifted from St. Mary Mead, leaving the village bathed in a pale sunlight that did little to warm the chill of suspicion lingering in its lanes. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, set out for a stroll through the village, her destination less a place than a purpose, to gather the threads of gossip that wove the fabric of the community. The murder of Victor Langston had stirred St. Mary Mead into a frenzy of whispers, and Miss Marple knew that the truth often hid in the casual remarks of those who thought themselves unobserved. Her frail appearance and gentle manner made her a confidant to many, and she intended to listen closely to the village's secrets. Her first stop was the post office, where Miss Cleet, the postmistress, presided over a counter cluttered with letters and parcels. The small shop was a hub of village life, its bell jingling with every arrival, and Miss Cleet's sharp eyes missed little. As Miss Marple purchased a stamp, she remarked lightly, "Such a sad business at the playhouse, Miss Cleet. I suppose everyone's talking of it." Miss Cleet's lips pursed, her hands pausing over a stack of envelopes. "Talking? They're doing nothing else, Miss Marple. Why, just yesterday, I heard Clara Vane was seen going into Victor's dressing room before the rehearsal started, looking agitated, Mrs. Price said, who was delivering a parcel nearby. Clara didn't stay long, but she was clutching her script like it was a lifeline." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "How interesting," she said. "Miss Vane must have been eager to discuss the play. Such dedication in the midst of such tension." Miss Cleet leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Dedication? Or something else?" Mrs. Price said Clara looked ready to cry or scream. "And then there's Tom Breyer. My nephew saw him lingering by the prop table just before intermission, muttering to himself. Something about not taking it anymore." Miss Marple nodded, filing the details away. "People do get so worked up in the theater," she said. "I recall a young man in my village, years ago, who let a slight fester until it consumed him. Small moments can lead to such large consequences." Leaving the post office, Miss Marple continued to the florist's, where Miss Rose, a cheerful woman with a penchant for dahlias, was arranging bouquets for Victor's memorial. "Miss Marple," she exclaimed, wiping her hands on her apron, "you're just the person to make sense of this dreadful affair. I saw Roland Finch the other evening, you know, burning papers in his garden. Looked like scripts or letters, hard to tell in the dark, but he was in a right hurry to be rid of them." Miss Marple's needles, which had emerged from her bag, clicked softly. "Burning papers? How curious. Perhaps he was clearing out old notes, though one does wonder why now, with so much at stake." Miss Rose nodded, snipping a stem with precision. "That's what I thought. And then there's Evelyn Hurst. I delivered flowers to the Bell Inn for her, lovely lilies, her choice, and noticed a stack of letters on her table. One had Victor's handwriting, I'm sure of it. Bold, like his stage presence. She tucked it away quick when she saw me looking." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind was a whirl of connections. "Letters can be such private things," she said, "and Miss Hurst does seem a woman who values her privacy. Thank you, Miss Rose. Your flowers will bring some comfort, I'm sure." Her next stop was the playhouse, where the doors stood open to admit a delivery of new props, the cast preparing to resume rehearsals despite the tragedy. Miss Marple slipped inside, her presence unnoticed amid the bustle. Clara Vane was on stage, rehearsing Victor's lines with a fervor that bordered on possession, her voice echoing through the auditorium. Miss Marple settled into a seat at the back, her knitting a quiet companion as she watched. Clara's delivery was flawless, but there was something in her eyes, a hunger, perhaps, or a shadow of guilt. "Practice," Miss Marple murmured. "Or preparation?" She rose and wandered backstage, where the prop table stood, its contents now meticulously labeled by the police. The corridor to the dressing rooms was quiet, but as she passed Victor's door, she paused, her nose catching a faint trace of lavender. Fainter now, but unmistakable. She recalled Miss Cleet's mention of Clara's visit, and made a mental note to ask Inspector Craddock about the timing. A brief visit before rehearsal could be innocent, but agitation suggested otherwise. As she returned to the auditorium, she overheard a conversation between two stagehands, their voices low but audible. Tom was in a state that night, one said, adjusting a rope. Kept muttering about Victor, how he'd had it coming. I thought he was just blowing off steam, but now... The other shushed him, glancing around, but Miss Marple's presence went unnoticed, her elderly figure blending into the shadows. She left the playhouse and made her way to the Bell Inn, hoping to catch Evelyn Hurst. The critic was in the lounge, her fountain pen poised over a notebook, but she looked up with a faint frown as Miss Marple approached. "Back again, Miss Marple," she said, her tone cool. "You're persistent, I'll give you that." Miss Marple smiled, settling into a chair. "Only curious, Miss Hurst. I heard you received a letter from Mr. Langston, perhaps a response to your review. He was quite passionate about his work, wasn't he?" Evelyn's hand tightened on her pen, but her voice remained steady. "Victor sent me a note, yes, full of bluster, as usual. I tossed it in the bin, hardly worth keeping. My reviews stand on their own merit." She paused, then added, "I was in the foyer all through intermission, as I told the inspector. Ask young Tommy Hill." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. "Of course, though letters can be so revealing, can't they? I remember a neighbor who kept every letter she received, even the angry ones. They told such a story, when read together." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing, returning to her writing with a dismissive air. Miss Marple thanked her and left, her mind on the letter Miss Rose had seen. A note from Victor, quickly hidden, suggested more than a casual exchange. She resolved to mention it to Craddock. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple found Inspector Craddock waiting, his hat in hand, and a look of exasperation on his face. "Miss Marple," he said, "you've got half the village feeding you clues. I've just spoken to the maid who cleaned backstage. She saw Clara near Victor's dressing room before the rehearsal, looking out of sorts." Her words. "And Tom Breyer was spotted by the prop table, muttering, though no one caught what he said." Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting resuming. "And Miss Hurst's letter?" she asked. "Miss Rose mentioned seeing one in Victor's hand." Craddock's eyebrows rose. "You don't miss a trick, do you? I'll check with the inn staff, see if that letter's still in the bin. As for Roland, we found ashes in his garden, but nothing legible. Scripts, maybe, or something else. He's claiming it was just old notes." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on her needles. "A village is full of secrets, Inspector, like a play with too many acts. Clara's visit, Tom's muttering, Roland's ashes, Evelyn's letter. Each is a line in the script, but the ending's not yet clear. Have you spoken to the stage manager about the key? The one in Victor's pocket was the only one used that night, I presume?" Craddock jotted a note. "Good point. I'll confirm with the stage manager. You're building a case, aren't you, Miss Marple?" She chuckled softly. "Only knitting a pattern, Inspector, but patterns reveal themselves. If you watch the stitches." She paused, her expression guileless. "Check the bin at the Bell Inn carefully. A letter from a murdered man might say more than its writer intended." As Craddock left, Miss Marple leaned back, her thoughts weaving through the village's secrets. Clara's agitation, Tom's bitterness, Roland's panic, Evelyn's concealment. Each was a thread, and together they formed a tapestry of motive and opportunity. She recalled a scandal in her youth where a hidden letter had betrayed a long-held grudge. "Secrets," she murmured, "are like props on a stage, meant to be seen, but only when the curtain rises." She would keep listening, keep watching, for the truth was close, hidden in the village's whispers. Chapter 9. The Perfume's Trail. The soft glow of dawn crept over St. Mary Mead, painting the village in hues of gold and shadow, yet the warmth of the morning did little to dispel the unease that clung to its lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat at her breakfast table, a cup of tea steaming beside her, her knitting idle for once, as her mind traced the threads of Victor Langston's murder. The faint scent of lavender, so persistent in the dressing room, had become a nagging clue, its delicate fragrance a stark contrast to the violence it concealed. Clara Vane, with her calculated charm and ambitious heart, was tied to that scent, and Miss Marple was determined to follow its trail. She set out for the playhouse, her shawl draped over her shoulders, and her knitting bag a familiar weight at her side. The village was stirring, its residents exchanging hushed words about the ongoing investigation, their eyes darting toward the playhouse as if it held secrets too heavy to bear. Miss Marple's steps were unhurried, her frail appearance belying the sharpness of her purpose. She had asked Inspector Craddock to meet her at the playhouse, suggesting he bring Clara Vane's handbag for examination, a request he had met with a raised eyebrow but no argument. At the playhouse, the auditorium was quiet, the stage bare save for a few props left from the aborted rehearsals. Inspector Craddock stood near the prop table. Clara's handbag, a stylish leather satchel, resting on a chair beside him. Clara herself was absent, having been called to the police station for further questioning, and Miss Marple noted the absence with a flicker of satisfaction. It would make her task easier. "Good morning, Inspector," she said, her voice gentle as she approached. "You've been most accommodating. I do hope I'm not troubling you too much." Craddock's lips twitched in a wry smile. "Trouble, Miss Marple? You're more help than half my men. You were right about the ink, matches Miss Hurst's pen exactly, though she still claims she never went near the dressing room. Now, what's this about Clara's handbag?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Only a small matter, Inspector. That lavender scent in Mr. Langston's dressing room has been on my mind. It's quite distinctive, and I recall Miss Vane wearing a similar fragrance. If she was in the room, as the scent suggests, her handbag might hold a clue." Craddock opened the satchel, revealing a jumble of items: an actress's essentials, a compact, a lipstick, a small notebook, and nestled among them a delicate glass vial half filled with lavender oil. He held it up, the liquid catching the light. "This what you meant?" he asked. Miss Marple nodded, her needles emerging from her bag as she settled onto a nearby seat. "Precisely. Miss Vane mentioned using lavender oil for her nerves, but it's curious, isn't it, that the same scent lingers in a room where a murder occurred? I wonder if you've tested the spilled water on the dressing table. It might tell us more than we expect." Craddock's brow furrowed, but he signaled to a constable to fetch the glass from the dressing room. "You think she used the oil to cover something up?" he asked. "A scent to mask her presence?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "It's possible, Inspector. In my village, years ago, a young woman spilled perfume to hide the smell of smoke after a small fire she'd caused. A distraction, you see, to draw attention elsewhere. The water in that glass might have served a similar purpose." The constable returned with the glass, carefully sealed in an evidence bag. Craddock examined it, noting the faint residue inside. "We'll send it to the lab," he said. "If there's lavender oil mixed in, it could place Clara in that room. Her alibi's shaky. No one saw her in the rehearsal room during intermission." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the corridor leading to the dressing room. "And the auburn hair I noticed on the mirror," she said, almost absently. "It matches Miss Vane's, doesn't it?" "Small things, Inspector, but they add up, like stitches in a pattern." Craddock jotted a note, his expression one of grudging admiration. "You've a knack for this, Miss Marple. I'll have the hair tested too, but Clara's insisting she was nowhere near the dressing room during intermission. Says she was practicing lines, alone." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on her knitting. "Solitude is a convenient alibi, but it leaves no witnesses. I recall a girl in my nephew's theater troupe, so eager for a role that she slipped into a rival's dressing room to borrow a costume. She claimed she was elsewhere, but a single hairpin gave her away. Small things, Inspector, betray the truth." Craddock dispatched the constable with the glass and turned back to Miss Marple. "You're building a case against Clara, aren't you? The scent, the hair, her visit before rehearsal. Miss Cleet confirmed that. By the way, said Clara looked fit to burst when she left Victor's room." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Did she now? How very telling. A young woman with ambition can be driven to desperate acts, especially when her dreams are thwarted. Miss Vane wanted the lead role, and Victor stood in her way." Leaving the playhouse, Miss Marple walked to the village green, where a small crowd had gathered for a memorial service for Victor. Clara was there, her face a mask of sorrow, but her eyes darted nervously as she caught sight of Miss Marple. The elderly woman offered a gentle smile, noting the locket Clara clutched, a nervous habit perhaps, or a sign of guilt. She recalled Miss Cleet's words about Clara's agitation and wondered what had passed between her and Victor before the rehearsal. At the memorial, Miss Marple spoke briefly with Mrs. Bantry, who was arranging flowers near a portrait of Victor. "Clara's playing the martyr well," Mrs. Bantry whispered, her eyes sharp. "But I saw her practicing Victor's lines yesterday, as if she'd already claimed the role. Bold, don't you think, with him barely gone?" Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "Bold, indeed. Ambition can make one forget propriety. I wonder, did you notice her perfume at the rehearsal? A lavender scent, quite strong." Mrs. Bantry's eyebrows rose. "Now that you mention it, yes. It was noticeable, even in the auditorium. You think it means something, Jane?" "Only a thread," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking as she resumed her knitting. "But threads lead to patterns, and patterns to truth." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her thoughts on the lavender trail. The vial in Clara's handbag, the scent in the dressing room, the spilled water. These were no coincidence. She recalled a scandal in her youth where a young woman had used perfume to mask the scent of poison in a rival's tea. "A distraction," she murmured, "to hide a deed." Clara's ambition was clear, but had it driven her to murder? The hair and the oil were damning, but Miss Marple needed more to be certain. Inspector Craddock arrived later, his face grim but determined. "The lab results are in," he said, settling into a chair. The glass had traces of lavender oil mixed with the water, same as the vial in Clara's bag. And the hair's a match for her, too. She's sticking to her story, but she's nervous, kept twisting that locket when I questioned her. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. A locket can be such a personal thing, Inspector. Have you looked inside it? Sometimes what we cherish reveals what we fear. Craddock made a note, shaking his head. You're a step ahead, as always. I'll have her bring the locket tomorrow. Anything else? Only a thought, Miss Marple said, her needles moving steadily. The lavender was a clever touch, but it betrayed her. A woman like Miss Vane, so careful with her image, might not realize how a scent lingers. Check the rehearsal room floor, Inspector. If she was there, as she claims, there might be no trace of lavender, unlike the dressing room. Craddock nodded, rising. I'll do that. You're weaving a tight net, Miss Marple. She smiled, her expression guileless. Just knitting, Inspector, but every stitch counts. As he left, she leaned back, her thoughts on Clara Vane. The lavender trail was clear, but the motive, envy, ambition, a moment of rage, was still a shadow. She recalled a young actress from her village, driven to sabotage by a rival's success. Envy, she murmured, is a fire that burns the heart. Clara Vane, she suspected, had let that fire consume her, and the truth was now within reach. Chapter 10. The Motive Unveiled. The morning sun broke through the clouds over St. Mary Mead, casting a rare clarity over the village, as if urging its secrets into the light. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her parlor with a cup of tea cooling beside her, felt the threads of Victor Langston's murder drawing tighter. The lavender scent, the auburn hair, the spilled water, all pointed to Clara Vane, whose ambition had cast a shadow over her poised exterior. Yet Miss Marple knew that suspicion was not proof, and proof required a final act to bring the truth to the stage. She resolved to orchestrate a gathering at the playhouse, where the suspects' facades might crack under scrutiny. She sent a note to Inspector Craddock, suggesting a reconstruction of the fateful intermission, inviting Roland Finch, Clara Vane, Tom Breyer, and Evelyn Hurst to the playhouse that afternoon. Craddock, accustomed to Miss Marple's unorthodox methods, agreed, though his tone carried a hint of skepticism. "You're setting a trap, aren't you?" he said when he visited her cottage to confirm. "I hope you know what you're doing, Miss Marple." Her eyes twinkled as she tucked her knitting into her bag. "Only a little stagecraft, Inspector. People reveal themselves when the spotlight turns their way. I recall a village fete, years ago, where a thief betrayed himself by flinching at a sudden question. Timing, you see, is everything." The playhouse was hushed when Miss Marple arrived, its auditorium dim and the stage bare, save for a single chair placed center stage. A prop, she thought, for truth rather than drama. The suspects gathered reluctantly, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. Roland Finch paced near the wings, his hands gesturing as if directing an invisible cast. Clara Vane stood poised but pale, her fingers twisting the locket at her throat. Tom Breyer slouched against a prop table, his scowl deeper than usual. Evelyn Hurst sat in the front row, her fountain pen tapping her notebook with an air of detached impatience. Inspector Craddock stood by the stage, his notebook ready, while a constable kept watch at the door. Miss Marple stepped forward, her frail figure commanding attention with its quiet authority. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice clear and gentle. "This dreadful business has cast a shadow over our little playhouse, and I thought it might help to revisit that night, to see if we've missed anything. Murder, you see, is like a badly knitted scarf. One loose stitch, and the whole thing unravels." Roland snorted, crossing his arms. A reconstruction? This isn't one of your detective stories, Miss Marple. I was in the lighting booth. As I told the inspector, I saw nothing. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she settled into a chair. Of course, Mr. Finch. The booth is such a solitary place, isn't it? Though I did notice the ladder's dust was undisturbed, save for a single smudge. Curious, for a director so dedicated to his lights. Roland's face flushed, but he said nothing, his eyes darting to the booth above. Miss Marple turned to Tom Breyer, her expression serene. And you, Mr. Breyer, were moving scenery, I believe? Yet the flats showed a mark too precise for the chaos of intermission. A grudge, perhaps, from years ago, might make one act with care. Tom's jaw tightened, his hands clenching. I told you, I was working. I didn't touch that dagger. You've got no proof. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze shifting to Evelyn Hurst. Miss Hurst, your pen left its mark on the dressing room door. A small thing, but telling. You were in the foyer, yet a minute's absence might go unnoticed in the crowd. Words, I find, can wound as deeply as actions. Evelyn's lips thinned, her pen stilling. I've said where I was, Miss Marple. Your theories are quaint, but baseless. Finally, Miss Marple turned to Clara Vane, whose composure seemed to falter under the weight of her gaze. Miss Vane, she said, you were practicing lines, alone, in the rehearsal room. Yet a scent of lavender followed you, and an auburn hair was found in Victor's dressing room. The spilled water, mixed with lavender oil, suggests a plan. A distraction, perhaps, to mask your presence. Clara's laugh was sharp, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of panic. This is absurd. I admired Victor. I had no reason to harm him. The lavender was his. He used oils for his nerves. And hair? It could belong to anyone. Miss Marple's needles paused, her voice calm but piercing. Not anyone, Miss Vane. The hair matches yours, and the lavender oil was found in your handbag. You visited Victor before the rehearsal, agitated, as the postmistress saw. You wanted the lead role, didn't you? Victor's decision to stay on crushed your hopes, and ambition can be a cruel master. Clara's hands trembled, clutching her locket. You're twisting things. I was in the rehearsal room. I didn't go near his dressing room during intermission. Miss Marple rose, her steps slow as she approached the stage. Let us consider the scene, she said. Victor's dressing room, locked from the inside, the key in his pocket. He let his killer in, someone he trusted, or at least did not fear. The dagger taken from the prop table was no impulse. It was chosen, deliberate. The spilled water, laced with lavender, was a clever touch, meant to confuse, to suggest Victor's own habits. But scents linger, Miss Vane, and yours betrayed you. Clara's face paled, her locket slipping from her fingers to the floor. She bent to retrieve it, her movements jerky. You're wrong, she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. Inspector Craddock stepped forward, his notebook open. Miss Vane, the lab confirmed the lavender oil in the glass matches your vial. The hair is yours, and the maid saw you near the dressing room before rehearsal, looking fit to burst. Care to explain? Clara's eyes darted to the others, then back to Miss Marple, who stood quietly, her expression one of gentle sorrow. You've no proof I was there during intermission, Clara said, her voice rising. No one saw me. Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes sharp. No one saw you in the rehearsal room either, Miss Vane, but the lavender tells a story, and the locket. May we see it? It seems so dear to you. Clara's hand closed over the locket, but Craddock, sensing the moment, stepped closer. Miss Vane, open it, please. With a trembling hand, Clara unclasped the locket, revealing a tiny photograph of herself in a starring role from another production, her face radiant. Beneath it was a scrap of paper, folded tightly. Craddock took it, unfolding it to reveal a note in Victor's handwriting. "Clara, you'll never outshine me. Accept it." The auditorium was silent, the weight of the note palpable. Miss Marple's voice broke the stillness. "A cruel taunt," she said softly. "Enough to push ambition into rage. You slipped into his dressing room during intermission, didn't you? You knew his habits, his trust in you. The dagger was there, on the prop table, and you seized it." Clara's composure shattered, her voice a raw whisper. "He laughed at me," she said, tears welling. "Said I'd always be second to him. I only meant to scare him, to make him see me. But he mocked me again, and I couldn't stop." She sank into the chair, her hands covering her face. Craddock signaled the constable, who stepped forward with handcuffs. "Clara Vane, you're under arrest for the murder of Victor Langston," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. Miss Marple watched as Clara was led away, her knitting needles still in her lap. "Ambition," she murmured, "can twist a heart as surely as a knife." As the others dispersed, Roland muttering about the play, Tom slinking away, and Evelyn scribbling furiously, Craddock approached Miss Marple. "You did it again," he said, shaking his head. "How did you know?" She smiled, tucking her knitting away. "People are like plays, Inspector. They follow patterns if you watch closely. Clara's ambition was her script, and the lavender was her curtain call." Chapter 11. The Confession. The twilight settled over St. Mary Mead with a quiet solemnity, as if the village itself were exhaling after the storm of Victor Langston's murder. The playhouse, now a place of grim revelation rather than theatrical triumph, stood silent, its doors locked and its stage empty. Miss Jane Marple, however, felt no sense of closure as she sat by her cottage fire, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm. The confession of Clara Vane, wrung from her under the weight of evidence and Miss Marple's relentless logic, had brought the case to its climax. But the elderly spinster knew that truth, like a well-knit scarf, required every stitch to be secure. Inspector Craddock had taken Clara into custody after her tearful admission at the playhouse, her words echoing in Miss Marple's mind. "I only meant to scare him, but he mocked me again, and I couldn't stop." The locket, with its cruel note from Victor, had been the final thread, unraveling Clara's carefully crafted facade. Yet Miss Marple, ever cautious, wanted to ensure no loose ends remained. She had seen cases where a confession was only half the story, and her instincts told her to revisit the details of that fateful night. She rose early the next morning, her shawl draped over her shoulders, and made her way to the police station, where Craddock had promised to share the details of Clara's formal statement. The station was a modest building, its walls lined with notices, and its air heavy with the scent of ink and polished wood. Craddock greeted her with a weary smile, his desk cluttered with reports. "Miss Marple," he said, gesturing to a chair, "you've got a nose for the truth, I'll give you that. Clara's given us a full confession, but I'd value your thoughts. You've a way of seeing what I miss." Miss Marple settled into the chair, her knitting bag at her side. "You're too kind, Inspector. I'm only an old woman who notices patterns. May I hear what Miss Vane said? A confession is like a script. Sometimes the lines hide more than they reveal." Craddock opened his notebook, his voice steady as he recounted Clara's statement. She admits she went to Victor's dressing room during intermission, says she wanted to confront him about the lead role. Her chance to shine, she called it. Victor had promised her the starring part in the next production, then reneged, saying she wasn't ready. That note in her locket was the final straw. She grabbed the dagger from the prop table. Says it was impulse, though I'm not so sure. When Victor laughed at her, called her a second-rate shadow, she lost control, stabbed him, locked the door with his key, and slipped out in the chaos. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes thoughtful. And the lavender oil, the spilled water, those were no impulse, were they? Craddock nodded, flipping a page. She admits to that, too. Said she poured the lavender oil into the glass and spilled it deliberately to make it seem like Victor's habit. She knew he used scents sometimes, thought it'd throw us off. The oil was from her handbag, as you suspected. She's clever, I'll give her that, but not clever enough to fool you. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. Cleverness often betrays itself, Inspector, like a girl in my village, years ago, who hid a stolen brooch in her sewing basket, thinking it safe among her threads. But the threads caught it, and so did she. Miss Vane's lavender was her undoing. Craddock leaned back, his expression a mix of admiration and curiosity. You pegged her from the start, didn't you? The hair, the scent, the locket, how did you know? Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze distant. I didn't know, Inspector, not at first, but people are like patterns, and Clara's was one of ambition stretched too far. The lavender was too distinct, the hair too precise to be chance, and her locket, such a personal thing, yet it held her motive. I recall a young man who carried a watch engraved with a rival's name, a reminder of his envy. Clara's locket was her reminder, and her confession proves it. Craddock closed his notebook, his eyes narrowing. There's one thing bothers me. The locked room. How did she manage it so neatly? The key was in Victor's pocket, no sign of tampering. She says she locked it after, but it's a heavy door, and she's not a large woman. Miss Marple nodded, her mind revisiting the dressing room. A heavy door, yes, but a simple lock. She knew Victor's habits, his trust in her as his co-star. She could slip in, confront him, and after... Well, a key is easily returned to a pocket. The toppled chair suggests a moment of surprise, not a struggle. Victor let her in, and she acted quickly. The lavender was her flourish, meant to mislead, but it led us to her instead. Craddock jotted a note, shaking his head. You make it sound simple, but it's a devil of a puzzle. We've checked the room again. No hidden passages, no tricks with the vent, just the key, the dagger, and that blasted lavender. She's facing trial now, and with her, confession. It's a solid case. Miss Marple's eyes softened, a trace of sadness in her expression. Poor girl, she said. Ambition is a fire, Inspector, and it burned her. I recall a cousin of mine, so eager for recognition that she lost herself in the pursuit. Clara wanted to be a star, but she dimmed her own light. Craddock rose, tucking his notebook away. You've a kind heart, Miss Marple, but a sharp mind. I'll need to get back to the station. Paperwork's piling up. Anything else you'd like me to check? Miss Marple tilted her head, her needles resuming their rhythm. Only a small thing, Inspector. The rehearsal room. Did you find any trace of lavender there? Miss Vane's alibi rested on her being there, but a scent like that clings. If it's absent, It strengthens her presence in the dressing room. Craddock's eyebrows rose. Good catch. I'll have the lads sweep the room again. You're a marvel, Miss Marple. She smiled, tucking her knitting away. Just an old woman with too much time, Inspector. But time lets one see the patterns others miss. As Craddock left, Miss Marple leaned back, her thoughts on Clara's confession. The pieces fit, the lavender, the hair, the note, but she felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing the truth had been laid bare. She recalled a village scandal, where a confession had come too late to undo the harm, and she hoped Clara's would bring some peace to St. Mary Mead. Jealousy, she murmured, is a cruel director, but truth always takes the stage. Chapter 12. The curtain rises again. The soft light of an autumn afternoon bathed St. Mary Mead in a golden hush, as if the village, wearied by the storm of Victor Langston's murder, sought solace in the quiet rhythms of its daily life. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage parlor, her knitting needles clicking with their familiar cadence, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside her. Clara Vane's confession had brought the case to a close, yet Miss Marple felt the lingering weight of tragedy, like a play that ends not with applause, but with a somber silence. The playhouse, once the heart of the village's pride, was preparing to reopen, and Miss Marple knew that life, like the theater, must go on. She had declined an invitation to the playhouse's memorial performance, a tribute to Victor led by a new actor stepping into his role. Instead, she chose the comfort of her cottage, where the fire crackled and the world felt ordered, if only for a moment. Her thoughts, however, drifted to the events of the past days. The locked room, the lavender scent, the cruel note in Clara's locket. Each had played its part in unraveling the mystery, and now, with Clara awaiting trial, the village could begin to heal. A knock at the door announced Doctor Haydock, his face flushed from a brisk walk, his eyes alight with the curiosity that always followed one of Miss Marple's triumphs. "Jane," he said, settling into an armchair, "you've done it again. The whole village is talking about how you pinned down Clara Vane. Craddock's calling you a marvel, and I'm inclined to agree. How did you see through her?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her needles never pausing. "People are like plays, Doctor," she said. "They follow patterns if you watch closely. Clara's ambition was her script, and she played it to the end. The lavender, the hair, the locket, they were her props, but they betrayed her." Haydock leaned forward, his hands clasped. "That lavender business was clever. Craddock told me the rehearsal room had no trace of it, just as you suspected. She was never there during intermission, was she?" Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on her knitting. "No, Doctor. She was in Victor's dressing room, driven by a moment of rage. I recall a young woman in my village, long ago, who let envy consume her over a rival's success. Clara's story was much the same. Ambition turned to desperation, and a single act changed everything." Haydock shook his head, marveling. "You see what others miss, Jane. The locket, that note. It was like something out of a novel. And the locked room? Craddock said it was simple. In the end, just a key and a quick hand." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Simple, yes, but clever. Clara knew Victor's trust, his habits. She locked the door behind her, returned the key to his pocket, and used the lavender to mask her presence. But scents linger, and truth has a way of rising to the surface, like cream in a churn. Haydock chuckled, sipping the tea she offered. "You make it sound poetic, but it's grim work. The playhouse is moving on, you know, Roland's directing a new lead, some young chap from London. They're rewriting the play to honor Victor. I hear Evelyn Hurst is writing a kinder review this time." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "A kinder review? How wise of Miss Hurst. And Mr. Breyer, is he still tending his props?" "Grumbling as ever," Haydock said. "But he's staying on. Says the stage is all he knows, grudge or no grudge. You cleared his name, Jane, and Roland's too. The village owes you." She waved a hand, dismissing the praise. "Nonsense, Doctor. I only listen and watch. People tell their own stories, if you give them the chance. Like my knitting, every stitch is small, but together they make a whole." Haydock rose, his smile warm. "Well, keep knitting, Jane. St. Mary Mead's lucky to have you." He paused at the door, glancing back. "Think we'll have quiet now, or is another drama brewing?" Miss Marple's lips curved, her expression serene, but her eyes sharp. "Human nature, Doctor, is the greatest stage of all. There's always another act waiting in the wings." As he left, Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting resuming its rhythm. The village would talk of Clara's downfall for weeks, but already the playhouse lights were glowing again, the stage ready for new stories. She thought of Victor, his charisma silenced, and of Clara, whose ambition had been her undoing. "The curtain falls," she murmured, "but it always rises again." Outside, St. Mary Mead settled into the evening, its lanes quiet but alive with the hum of life. Miss Marple's needles moved steadily, each stitch a testament to her quiet vigilance. The murder was solved, the truth laid bare, but she knew another puzzle would come, as surely as the seasons turned. For now she was content to knit, to watch, and to wait for the next act in the village's endless drama.